Welcome to the Global Connection, a Tel Aviv University podcast. Journey with us as we discover how TAU's academic community and friends are engaging with and helping to shape this ever-changing world.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Hana Wirth-Nesher, professor of English and American Studies at Tel Aviv University, and also the founding director of the Goldrich Institute for Yiddish Literature and Culture. And it is a great pleasure and honor for me this morning to speak with Rabbi Delphine Horvilleur, an inspiring intellectual and spiritual leader. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. Delphine, if I may, is a female rabbi in France, one of only a handful, and a co-leader of the liberal Jewish movement of France, affiliated with the World Union of Progressive Judaism. She's the editor of the quarterly magazine Tnu'a, Revue de Pensée Juive, and she leads a congregation in Paris. She's also the author of several influential books, among them In Eve's Attire, Modesty, Judaism, and the Female Body, as well as a book on anti-Semitism entitled Anti-Semitism Revisited. And her most recent book is Living with Our Dead, which has been translated into Japanese and Korean and, of course, English, and will now also be available in Hebrew. As a female, feminist, liberal rabbi in Europe, educated in France, but also in Israel and the United States, Delphine is contributing to building bridges between the diasporic and Israeli Jewish community. She's also co-written a book on Islam and Judaism with a liberal Muslim scholar. All of this so much needed now more than ever. And I just want to quote from Delphine, "I try to build bridges between worlds that have stopped talking to each other." But before we get to all of those issues, which I'm very eager to discuss with you, can you tell me something about yourself? That is, how did you arrive at your life's work? What path brought you to this moment? And perhaps start with your family or whatever, up to you.
So it's a pleasure to be here, really, and to spend this moment in Israel, this particular moment. I grew up in France. My family comes from different backgrounds. My father's side is really from the original French Jewry history, many centuries in France. And my mother's family comes from Eastern Europe. They arrived after the war. They were survivors of the Shoah, and I was born in France. And I moved to Israel when I was 17, alone. I decided to come. I studied at the university. It was kind of like the first season of my life. I was studying medicine at the time. Then I became a journalist. Then I moved to New York. Then I joined rabbinical school. It's been full of turning points and moments. And I was ordained in 2008 and moved back to Paris. And as you said, I became a rabbi and a writer. But I feel that somehow, all those pieces of the puzzle connect more than what it seems. What I was looking for in the medical school and then as a journalist is actually what I do as a rabbi. I try to stand by people's side and welcome their narrative as kind of sacred text. That's part of what I try to do.
Mm-hmm. Yes. What strikes me about your family background is that on the paternal side, it's centuries in France, and so it provides a certain sense of security or stability, whereas on your mother's side, it's recent Jewish history with all of the turmoil and upheaval and vulnerability. So it's an interesting combination.
I think, it has a lot to do with the balance somehow that I feel inside me or inside my work, that on my father's side, it's a story of being saved by righteous among the nations. It's a story of being grounded and belonging to a territory. Whereas on my mother's side, it's a story of being uprooted and a story of death and devastation. And I feel that as a child, there was inside my family story something that was a kind of irreconcilable narrative, that one part of my family was telling me that the neighbor might save me, and one part of my family was telling me that the neighbor might kill me.
Yes.
So I had to figure out how, I could bring together those two elements of the family narrative. And somehow I feel that these unbreachable, stories have a lot to do with what I'm trying also to do as a commentator of the text. The text, the sacred text, always also asks you to figure out how to reconcile the irreconcilable elements.
Yes. So interpreting sacred texts, I understand that during COVID you started weekly talks, lectures on Zoom.
Indeed.
And could you just tell us something about that and the COVID and how that has also shaped where you are now?
Yeah, well, I've been teaching for years now. I started a Bet Midrash, a study house, first in New York and then in Paris. And during the COVID, as many of us, we had to reinvent the way we wanted to talk and teach and be there for others. And I launched a virtual Bet Midrash through the magazine and the association I had Tnua, and it became a kind of very weird rendezvous, and suddenly people joined that Bet Midrash through Zoom, through internet, yes. And thousands of people were connected every Tuesday in France and beyond, in Europe, Jews and non-Jews. And until today, it's very moving for me. I meet people who tell me, you helped us go through that COVID and confinement. People who sometimes have zero relationship to Judaism or religious thoughts. France is known to be a very secular, sometimes perceived to be a very anti-religious country in a way. And it's striking to see that this Bet Midrash was a moment of encounter for many. And then many people continue to join the Bet Midrash, even when it was back into, present mode. It's quite interesting. Now I lead a Bet Midrash, a house of study, monthly house of study. And we have like 350 people every month come to study with us Bible and Talmud and Gemara. And thousands of people join through virtual means, much beyond the Jewish community, which is also interesting. I'm very proud of this, of what we managed to create somehow in this moment.
So the post or the COVID or the post-COVID book that is now being launched here and that so many people have read around the world, Living with Our Dead. Who is the our in Our Dead?
Well, it's interesting because there is in French a play on word that cannot be heard in English. When you say in French, living with our dead, you say Vivre avec Nos Morts. It can also mean living with our death. So there is this double meaning, living with our dead and with our death, suggesting that all of us do have to live with the disease, with people who we love and who died and left us. But also I think that each one of us has to live with his or her own death processes. I mean, there's no way we can go through life without surrendering part of our life, without, acknowledging that we keep dying, something in us. It's true biologically, but it's true philosophically. We keep on dying. Something in us, leaves us. Sometimes it's an idea we had, a conviction. Sometimes it's a love story. Sometimes it can be, a dream. And it's something healthy. We tend to perceive, and I think we're wrong when we do that. We tend to perceive life on one side and death on the other, as if those were two separate words that don't have encounters. But I think that actually, for life to go on, death processes are essentials in our life. As we talk now in our podcast, everything is okay for us? Within half an hour of conversation, hopefully many of our cells in our body will engage in a dying process, because this is how we remain alive, actually. So I thought it was interesting to acknowledge that life and death are constantly working hand in hand, and we have to figure out how we engage in a conversation with death, with dead ones also, how they remain somehow in a dialogue with us as we continue living.
So all of that is very moving and universal. And so much of your work and your life and your role, your leadership role, is within the Jewish people and within the Jewish community. So perhaps this would be a good time to switch over. It's not really switching that much, I think. Death and life is certainly a part of the conversation between the diaspora Jewish community and the Israeli Jewish community. So I would like to know why that conversation is so difficult and so complicated, and seems to be becoming even more complicated with all of the recent developments. So that's a big question, but
But it's a question that is very dear to my heart, and I think to yours too.
Yes.
This question of the dialogue between Israel and the diaspora. I'm particularly happy and moved to be here this week because I feel that for years now, I've been trying to have this conversation and something is like stuck. Each time I come to Israel, even though I speak Hebrew pretty well, I think, I always feel that the dialogue is frozen, interrupted. There's something that I'm trying to teach or to share here, and it gets no answer. It's as if the conversation was blocked somehow between diaspora and Israel. And I think precisely it has to do maybe with the theme of my book in a way, with the acknowledgement that just like in the mourning process, something in us is deeply broken. For years I've been teaching and writing about what is for me the core of the Jewish identity. The core of the Jewish identity, I believe, is an acknowledgement of our brokenness. Like Jews in their history acknowledged constantly the uncompletedness of their identity. It seems like a big word, but I think when you think about Jewish history, obviously, but also Jewish rituals, it's always about brokenness, uncompletedness, vulnerability. Moses comes down of Mount Sinai, he breaks the tablet, the temples are built and broken. We get married, we break a glass. We own money, we give ma'asar, like we surrender part of what we own. A baby boy is born, there is a brit milah, something is cut. Like it's always an acknowledgement that we should be aware of a feeling of owning or being complete, because something is dangerous in this moment of strength and owning. And sometimes I felt that when I tried to teach this in Israel, it goes against the Zionist narrative. The Zionist narrative, as we know, and we know why, and we totally understand why, is a narrative of power, of strength, of owning, of building, of being complete and back in the land. And I feel that often the Jewish narrative, as paradoxical as it may sound, counters very strongly the Zionist narrative. And I don't manage to engage in these conversations for years. And suddenly, and I would maybe that's for me the fascinating conversation today with Israel, is that suddenly in the current political crisis, something opens. It seems to me that many of my Israeli friends suddenly understand what I mean, as if this feeling of the system being broken, or this feeling of being suddenly the other in a society, or something like the end of a powerful and strength narratives, enable them to reconnect to this ancient story. So for me, it's a fascinating moment.
That is a fascinating moment, but let's pursue that a little bit. That sense of brokenness in the diaspora is a result of, history of persecution and so on. And yes, the Zionist narrative is one of completion. But it's not as if Israelis don't experience a sense of brokenness and vulnerability. It was just 2 weeks ago we had Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron. And they're, having lived here now 40 years, I know there's a constant sense of fragility. So I wonder what's the difference between the fragility and the vulnerability? I just wanted to ask one more thing. My sense now of some of the brokenness is that the other is not, as it is in the diaspora, the other is the non-Jew. But what's happening here is that the other is within the Jewish people. And that's not unprecedented, but certainly not a strain of Jewish history since the Churban. Right?
Yeah.
So
I think you're right. There is a sense of fragility also in this society. And when you watch movies and series and Jewish creativity, Israeli creativity here, you perceive it. But still, there is a kind of very strong counter-reaction to the acknowledgement of fragility in the Israeli society. When I used to live here in the 90s, a few years ago, I remember I was struck, and I'm still struck by an Israeli expression that keeps coming back in conversations when people say, in Hebrew, it's like, lo latzet frayer, don't be a loser, or something like that. It's always the fear of being the loser of the story. And for me, it's a striking expression because when I think about it, I do believe in a way that my Jewish experience is a Freier experience.
Yes.
Like, in diaspora, we acknowledge that we've been very often the loser in history, but we managed to transform that into a strength. Like, I think that often Jewish diasporic experience is a kind of genius way to build upon fragility, vulnerability, being a loser, not being the majority, not being powerful, not having sovereignty. So I think it's interesting that actually we all manage with this fragility, but the Israeli language tries to figure out, how we can somehow get rid of what exists and is part of a experience. But for me, where the conversation today should lead us, and you won't be surprised that I talk like this as a rabbi, is in a way going back to essential ideas of our text and our literature and our tradition. There is the most central idea in the Bible, and it's the word that keeps coming back again and again. It's the idea of being a ger. Like, this idea that we understand the ger. In Hebrew, it's like the other. Let's call it. We understand the other. Ki ger haytem be'eretz Mitzrayim, because you were the other in the land of Egypt. You know the art of the ger, of the other. Abraham comes to this land and defines himself as ger toshav, like an alien resident. There is always this feeling of being the other, that you remain with us even when we belong, even when we settle, even when we are on the land. And for me, the opposite of the ger is the feeling of being the owner, what we could call in Hebrew Baal or Baalut. If you're a Baal Bait, if you're the owner, then you forget that inside you there is this otherness. And I think this is a very political analysis of the situation today. You have many people here who claim in the name of Judaism suddenly that they have ownership, that they are the owners of the land. I was struck recently in the election posters to see that the poster of Otzma Yehudit, of the party of Ben Gvir, was the slogan, Mihen Baalei Habayit, who is the owner, suggesting that we, the Jews, are the owners and maybe the Arabs are not. But it's interesting because this word, Baal, in our text is actually associated with idolatry. The Bible keeps saying, you're a ger, and don't behave like the Canaanians who give a cult to Baal, the name of their god, that we shouldn't serve, is Baal, its owner. So if you become an idolatress of ownership, then you stop being an Hebrew, according to the Bible. So I thought, it's a very interesting way to look at political situation, and it's a question of political science and political philosophy. How do you become, how do you settle? How do you have sovereignty and strength and the violence that goes with it, according to political theories? But still, how do you remain faithful to an ancient Jewish idea of cherishing the otherness inside you?
Yes. Well, that clash now of ownership in Israel is very much split along secular religious lines. Not entirely, but in many ways, yes. And the so-called secular side, the basis of many of the ideas go back to France, right? It's the République, and it's also secularism as almost as a sacred concept. So can we talk for a minute about the specificity of France, the French diaspora, and what can Israel learn from that secular religious split? You have succeeded in bringing religion, some sacredness, spirituality, into a very binary system in France, and we also have very binary systems. So what do you think?
Yeah, it's been one of my biggest challenges when I'm in America or in Israel, and I try to explain French laïcité. That's the term for the French secularism. But it's definitely not the American secularism, and it's obviously very different also from the French system, from the Israeli system. And France's system is often perceived to be totally anti-religion, but it's more complex than that. There is an absolute separation between religion and state in France. And the promise of the République, as you said, the promise of the French laïcité, could be formulated this way. French history and French Republic promises that each citizen will be able always and in each situation to speak in the first person singular and not in the first person plural. Like in the French Republic, there is no we. It's almost a play on word like we, the yes, the French. Mm-hmm. There is no we, W-E. Mm-hmm. There is always an I. Like as a French citizen, there is a guarantee that I can always say I believe, I think, I do. Huh? But I never speak as a Jew or as a collective or as a nation inside the nation, which is very different from the American system that guarantees communities freedom. Like, when I used to live in New York years ago, I was always struck that many people, and still today, start their sentences in America saying, as a Jew, I believe that. As a gay, I think that. As a black person, I consider that.
You have to have a subject position.
Yeah. Whereas, this very sentence is impossible in France. Mm-hmm. Like, it makes no sense. You don't speak as a Jew. You can say, I'm Jewish, I'm Parisian, I'm a mother, I lived abroad, I love to eat sushi. You can multiply your affiliations and your identity definitions, but it doesn't make sense to speak as a community, because then it's as if your community was monolithic, as if your community believed something, voted something. It doesn't make sense. So there is this absolute promise of deconnection in a way, which is a fiction. We will agree on that. It's a fiction. For example, when France says that no religious sign should be worn in public schools,
yes,
we suggest that people can leave their belongings at the entrance as if they were leaving their coats. You leave your religious belief. It's obviously not true, but we create a fiction that in this sacred space of the French Republic, this public school, there should be no pressure whatsoever coming from any type of community. It should be, in a way, fictionally neutralized so that we can create a space that is bigger than my belief or yours. So it's almost a religious idea, I would say, yes, because it's a transcendental idea. We create a space that will never be filled by your practice, your belief, your story. It's bigger than that.
Yes. Jews in France and around the world now have been experiencing rising anti-Semitism, which requires collective thinking and collective responsibility. So how has the rise in anti-Semitism affected how Jews in France see themselves? But mainly, to get back to the Israeli diaspora conversation, how does that affect how Jews, and I want to qualify that, liberal Jews, how does that affect the way they see Israel? Mm-hmm. Feeling more vulnerable now. That is let me just qualify that a little bit more. Is Israel, what do liberal diaspora Jews need from Israel? It's not just a safe haven in case. What kind of Jewishness, what do they need?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not even sure I know how to answer your question. For sure, and we spoke a lot about this in recent years in the face of the rising anti-Semitism in France, among other places, because we know anti-Semitism is on the rise pretty much everywhere. It's true that for many in the French Jewish community, Israel became the place of security, the guardian state. So some of them moved to Israel. We spoke a lot about the Aliyah process. I don't even know the numbers today because some French Jews moved to Israel. Some French Jews took the Israeli citizenship but remained in Paris. Some moved to Israel and moved back to France. So we don't know the numbers, but for sure the phenomenon existed. And it also made the link to Israel closer. Like I think that in recent years, French Jews feel even closer to Israel, but it doesn't mean that they feel closer to the nation, but not necessarily to the government. I mean, there's part of French Jews, and it's all very often the way French Jews are perceived to be very pro-Israeli government. It's not necessarily true. I think there is also a high level of criticism toward Israeli politics and policy, but the relationship is very strong. Also because it's close. I know many people now in France, French Jews who come often to Israel, even sometimes for the weekend. That's very close, geographical, intense relation to the country. And I think, I think it's something that is getting stronger. That's why probably the crisis today is so critical, because around me I see that suddenly mouths open in France. People who would have never criticized the Israeli government are willing to share their feeling. And some people around me also who support strongly Israel are remaining silent. Suddenly they don't want to they don't want to add their voice to Israeli criticism, but the situation is for them, a very painful one.
Yes.
That's why this conversation is so important, because just like in a love story, because the relationship is so dear, so then the dialogue becomes over critical.
Yes.
We have so much to lose.
Yes. Do you think the term diaspora is still useful? The Diaspora Museum here changed its name, right, to Anu, our people. It has the notion of dispersal. Is it dated or is it still relevant?
For me, it can be still relevant, but what needs to change is a certain paradigm that is, for me, outdated. This idea that we still hear often in Israel that around the table, the different geographies of Jewish people would be sitting, and Israel is perceived to be kind of the big brother or the head of the family. I think this paradigm doesn't work anymore. I think, I think there is a kind of patronizing imagery in this that cannot work anymore. The fact that Israel would be perceived as being, the heart, the center, and the rest of the diaspora would be like, misled young brother, just like around the Pesach table that you would have the Chacham, the wise son,
yes.
And the diaspora would be, in the best case, the rebellious, or maybe the one who doesn't even know how to express itself.
Depends which diaspora you're talking about, right?
So
right.
I think it's much more useful to perceive maybe the Jewish people as a body with different ways to express itself, and in the same way, I would, in the same way that very often, as you can imagine, I'm in dialogue with conservative voices of Judaism or Orthodox voices in Judaism, and they tend to perceive liberal voices as being less authentic or less pure or less real. I don't know. I think this is absolute nonsense. I think that all those voices and the power of our people comes a lot from its diversity, its plurality, the way that it always expressed itself in different languages. And I think that more than ever, and I'm happy to say it to you, because I know it's dear in your research, but I think that this bilingual and multilingual power of the Jewish people is our strength. And when we erase part of our languages, then all of us are impoverished in our possibility to be.
Yes. So as we reach a conclusion to our conversation, which of course could go on much, much longer, let me ask you one last question. In this dialogue between diaspora and Israel, what can each side learn from the other? What can Israel learn from the diasporic experience? So that I think you've already expressed very eloquently about a certain sense of brokenness and fragility, but the other way around. What can the diaspora learn from Israel, or both, whatever?
Yeah. Well, as I said, I think that we will deeply need each other, and I think we are at this moment that I call the brokenness or otherness that can be perceived as a challenge or a tragedy, or can be perceived as an opportunity. In Hebrew, there is this magnificent word, biblical word, mashber, which means crisis in modern Hebrew. But in the Bible, mashber is a birthing tool. Like it's where you give birth. So actually, mashber is the possibility to create something new, to bring renewal to the world. So I think we really need to perceive this moment as as this possibility. A few weeks ago, I heard David Grossman speaking at a demonstration, and he said something striking. He said, for the first time in my life, I feel like a foreigner in my own country. And I know that for the Israeli ear, that sentence sounded like a tragedy. But for me, this sentence was almost a kind of blessing.
Yes.
I felt suddenly, it's wonderful that suddenly my diaspora Jewish experience and his very Israeli experience can connect in this feeling of, this fragility, these uncertainties. That can be grounds for really new, amazing discoveries in what we could be and what could connect us.
So on that note, on a note of blessing and on a note of how the energy now in Israel can be galvanized toward a better future for the diaspora and Israel, thank you. Thank you very much for this conversation. It's very important, and wish you well. Thank you.
Thank you so much.